with concepts kind of having been shed, it was also obvious that reality is whole, one, unitive, the kind of oneness people talk about in most religious traditions or in spiritual experiences. Brains don't exist as brains. Brains are totally interwoven with the nervous system. It's actually an illusion to think there is a separate thing called a brain. You're like, oh, I've been like stressed and like, why was I doing that? Like, this is where people start talking about like a cosmic joke. It's just like, I was playing this weird prank on myself of selfhood. I come to the conclusion, well, the only way that makes sense to me is if reality is relational, if consciousness is a kind of relationship between a bodily organism and an environment, and that means that life is the thing that makes consciousness, brings it into existence. To me, the deepest insight of spirituality is meaninglessness in a liberating way. Reality is a play. It's a meaningless play. And like, if you stop and ask a kid what's the meaning of their play, you're going to ruin the play.
Welcome to the Quantum Theory Podcast. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Quantum Theory Podcast. Today we are joined by a fascinating guest, and that is Dr. James Cooke. Dr. Cooke is a trained neuroscientist who actually had a mystical experience, or what you may call an awakening experience as a teenager, that led him down the path of his current studies of converging science and spirituality, and more so the reality of spiritual states of consciousness. He holds 3 degrees from Oxford University, so quite a bright guy, and those are a PhD and master's in neuroscience, as well as a bachelor's in experimental psychology. He's further conducted scientific research for over a decade at institutions such as Oxford University, of course, University of California, Berkeley, University College London, Trinity College Dublin, and Riken Brain and Sciences Institute in Tokyo. James is the author of The Dawn of Mind, How Matter Became Conscious and Alive, which was published late last year, which synthesizes science and spirituality and really offers a radical solution to the hard problem of consciousness. So today we have a absolutely wonderful and insightful episode. And without further ado, please enjoy the conversation with Dr. James Cooke. Well, thanks so much, James, for coming on the show. Super excited to dive in here, specifically around your most recent work, The Dawn of Mind, and your theory around consciousness that I believe quite beautifully fits a lot of the major issues within consciousness theories nowadays around the mind-body problem, the heart problem, and of course, many others. But before we jump into all these areas of your theory, I'd love just to really quickly, James, firstly, obviously, thank you for coming on the show. And secondarily, I'd love to give the audience a little background into your work and current field of study. And in that process, I'd love for you to as well kind of touch on that somewhat mystical experience that you had in your younger years that led to your work today.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. It's very nice to be here with you. Yeah, that is a good place to begin, probably. So, I was always quite a kind of scientifically, rationally minded kid. But I was raised Catholic. And so the issue of blind faith, of having belief in a God that I couldn't see, couldn't detect, had no evidence for, that was an issue for me. But I was sufficiently intimidated by the prospect of hell that there was an issue here I needed to resolve. I wasn't trying to be defiant by not having blind faith. I just didn't have it. I couldn't figure out where to get it from because I didn't have, by definition, it's not something that can be based in evidence or reason. It just needs to arise. So I was really ruminating about this in a way where it felt like my existence really depended on figuring out this issue. And basically, my thinking was banging up against an impossible riddle, something that couldn't be solved with thought. And so eventually the thinking just had to give up. It was totally absorbed into this. So my mind didn't just wander off into thinking about something else, like what am I going to have for dinner? It was totally absorbed until the point of exhaustion and then stopped. And then what happened then was, the words people use like mystical experience, awakening sound very kind of grandiose. And, it has that sense of really waking up to reality as opposed to the world we typically live in, which is really filtered through concepts and thoughts. But on the other hand, it was incredibly simple. It was just being fully present. It was just like in Zen when they talk about just, feeling the ground under your feet when you walk, being truly mindful and present, but just a kind of 100% collapse of my attention, awareness, everything about my experience of a reality was absorbed into the here and now. And it was suddenly in an instant really obvious that the human condition is one of always overlooking what's truly here, overlooking reality, which is this moment with these sensory appearances, and living in, well, next week when I do this and next week feels so real, but it's not. It's like, it's a way of talking about when this moment will transform into a new moment, but it's always this ever changing now. So that was really obvious. And with concepts kind of having been shed, it was also obvious that reality is whole, one, unitive, the kind of oneness people talk about in most religious traditions or in spiritual experiences, a sense that my feeling of being apart from the world is just an idea. And that rather it's the world is like an ocean, an energy, a kind of single ocean of energy. And I'm like a wave arising within that. But my true nature is just that energy of existence, the beingness that I share with everything. And the idea that there's a thing inside this body, a James that gets to own experience and is the kind of controller of the ship, like that's a thought. That's an illusion that this wave, this organism comes up with. It's a bit like if waves in the ocean imagined they had surfers on them when they didn't, and that somehow allowed them to like navigate more effectively, but it made them really fearful and existentially anxious because they were like, I've got to protect the surfer. If the surfer gets killed, then that's really bad. But the surfer's just an idea. It's a simulation. So in the same way, this organism that's just the energy of existence, it gets this idea that there's some self in here, some ego, some James that's truly set apart from the world, like the surfer, but that's just an idea. And when you see that, you're like, oh, well, this wave energy is no different from that wave energy. Like if my true nature is just the beingness, that's not going anywhere. Like when this body dies, that's, it's alive in you, it's alive in the tree and in the cup. It's the beingness is everything. So it really uproots the kind of the fear of death, which is the fear on which everything else is based. So that's why these kinds of insights lead to relief from suffering, because the human condition is this kind of anxious, vigilant, like, I'm going to die is like the fundamental feeling tone, the fundamental issue. It feels like something's wrong in existence. The fact that you're going to die feels like that's not okay. Like there's been a mistake here, kind of existentially. And there hasn't been a mistake. That the idea that there is someone inside the organism who's going to die is an illusion. So it's very liberating. That's taken up a lot of time. So I'll give you a chance to come back before I go and monologue about my science stuff.
No, thank you. There's certainly a lot to unpack there. And I think that segues pretty well into really just understanding your general perspective on consciousness and kind of get into some of the brass tacks here around biopsychism and generally, I think as well, kind of placing your theory within the broader tapestry of idealism to physicalism, back to panpsychism and kind of where you fit into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So with this kind of, you could call it a new perspective, it's often called non-duality because it's non-separation, non-two-ness. The concepts are the things that make reality seem dualistic. And so, as I was saying, there's this sense of oneness underneath it. But that's a sense of reality just being this bare appearance, bare, non-conceptual, you can't put words to it, unnameable, ineffable. So there isn't a need after that to then go and tell stories about reality, which is what we're doing when we talk about idealism and theories of consciousness. Then we're kind of going back into thoughts, trying to figure out how the puzzle pieces of the world fit together. That's not strictly necessary, but a lot of people find it compelling. Like after this, we have a model of reality as a separate self, of a solid material reality of different objects. That becomes questioned with these experiences. And so it's kind of natural that model wants updating. It's like, okay, well, what's really going on? Is it all a cosmic mind? Is it, so I think I had that, that compulsion. But some people can it's good to be clear on whether one is pursuing the kind of experiential, awakening, contemplative spirituality path or the intellectual path at any one time. You can do both. I did both, but I was very hygienic about about knowing when I was doing each. Because if you think you're doing the spirituality thing by ruminating on idealism, that's actually a way to block the shedding of thoughts, concepts into surrender. So just to note that. So, that's kind of why I spent after that experience, like 2 decades, just really obsessed with trying to piece together what's actually going on, and became a neuroscientist, very interested in philosophy and just really sincerely trying to reckon with reality. A lot of people do go to idealism, the idea that only mind exists. The way that's often presented, I felt didn't answer all the questions. Specifically, there seems to be some kind of loopiness in the way that So if I have an experience of something, there's a way in which the structure of what's going on in my brain seems to constrain that. So if you stimulate my somatosensory cortex, I might have a feeling of tickling arise or something. And there seems to be this kind of two-way relationship where what you're experiencing seems to shape brain activity. Because if I decide I'm going to go drink coffee, and then I imagine the drinking the coffee, that could activate other parts of the brain that then give me that experience of the taste. So it seems to be some kind of interesting loopiness where it's not as simple as just saying, no, what's real is the taste of the coffee. And then like what an idealist might say is the brain is like more consciousness that just looks so it doesn't seem to really get to that loopiness to me. So it's slightly more complicated than that picture was suggesting, is what I felt. And so that's kind of really what I've been fleshing out. But I think to a lot of people who are mind only idealist type people, if they have an open mind to what I'm saying, I think they'll see that actually the core things they think they get out of that, they get out of my picture as well. Because there is a kind of, I guess it's like a lot of dilemmas or issues in kind of intellectual inquiry end up having this kind of dialectical structure, by which I mean people inhabit two extremes. They're the materialists and they're the idealists. And when I see that, it's usually a good bet there's some synthesis to be found. You can sometimes just have someone's delusional, someone's got it right. Like that can happen. Like the awakening stuff can be like, oh, reality is made of separate objects. No, actually, you can wake up out of that and see it's non-conceptual. I would say there isn't really well, actually, even there's a synthesis to understand the nature of object perception. Why do we feel that the world is made of separate objects? So usually there's some synthesis to be found, and that's kind of what I'm offering. There are loads of different ways we could come at it now, so I'll bounce back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would love just to go straight into that, because that is actually a key question I had, is about the idea of separation, kind of the fiction of objects. And I'm curious how far you go with that, because I recall reading a good bit of that in your book, The Dawn of Mind. And I was just curious specifically, would you go as far as a Donald Hoffman figure and say, neurons don't exist unperceived, or are we collapsing that wave function, or please go.
Yeah, so that is you're really getting to the thing that's hardest for the mind to grasp, I would say, because we see through object perception, and because that what happens is we reify what we perceive, which means we make it more real than it is. So a good example would be a weed. If you're a gardener and you're like, okay, I've planted roses, I want roses here, and then some other seeds fall in and some other plants that aren't roses are there, you assess, categorize those as weeds, and you say those are weeds because I don't want them here. That's what makes it a weed. It's a purely functional way of looking at the world that depends on your goals. And so in that situation, but we don't usually notice that nuance. What we feel is, well, that is objectively a weed. I'm looking at a weed. That is what that is. And so that's what I'm talking about with the reification. So weeds don't actually exist as weeds. If all the humans died on the earth, if there would be no weeds, there would just, all the plants would still be there, but they wouldn't be. The concept weed is a lot more relational, to do with how we are showing up and relating to the world than just as simple as, okay, a weed has essence of weed in it. So this is referred to as emptiness in Buddhism, the recognition that things are empty of essence. And this is that kind of synthesis thing. So Donald Hoffman is someone, who goes the kind of like the moon isn't there when no one's looking at it kind of, idealism. And the other extreme is, well, everything's made of solid, everything just is what it appears to be. Everything has an essence of what it seems to have. The emptiness thing is a very subtle thing in the middle, which, and I really believe this is, a lot of this comes out of really kind of sophisticated Buddhist philosophy. At the moment, I'm reading a lot of a guy called Jay Garfield, who I'm going to have a conversation with soon, who's a really excellent scholar on this stuff. And he the way he describes it is, he says that, so the weed is illusory because, and by illusory, he means the way it exists, its mode of appearance is different to its mode of existence. So we think it looks like a weed. That's how it appears. It appears like it's just a weed. And you might think, well, if it looks like it's just a weed, maybe that's because it is just a weed. Like it wouldn't be an illusion. It just is. Its mode of existence being a weed, and its mode of appearance, it looks like a weed, are exactly the same. The picture I said, where it's actually its mode of existence is you're a gardener with intentions of how you're looking at the world. And so for you, that is a weed, but that is a very complicated relational web of entanglements that makes it a weed. So its mode of existence, that web of entanglements that involves the human mind, and its mode of appearance, that's a weed, are different. That's what makes it illusory. So that's a really good, that's Jay Garfield's way of describing emptiness. I think that's good. So, a bus is empty of essence of bus, because what is a bus? If all the humans died, it would be a pile of metal and rubber, but you don't want to walk in front of it. It's still going to hit you. Like, it's not,
Right.
even if you walk in front of it with your eyes closed in the Donald Hoffman view, no one's say it's out of control. No one's driving it. No one's witnessing it, but you're right. It was still, that might be a caricature, because the final thing to say that's really hard to grasp, and it's kind of ungraspable, but is that I think because of this is where we do get to the kind of collapse of the wave function thing, where I think because reality is a single interdependent web, again, this emptiness thing, everything in existence is illusory, in that sense that everything's mode of existence is the web of the one thing that exists, manifesting as these different waves, but it doesn't look like that. So everything's illusory in that sense. And so in that sense, like it does, when you really feel into that, the existence of the moon really does depend on its relations with everything else in existence. So it gives me a sense of why people think things like neurons don't exist when they're not perceived. I think it's more like the kinds of relations, the kind of interactions that we call physics, I think is what's doing the hard work there, not the kinds of interactions that we call minds. So that's why I think neurons do exist when they're not being perceived by a human or by a conscious being, because the kind of interactions of physics are kind of keeping things woven together. So that's the core of my metaphysics, is a relational picture where physics is this web of interactions, and where everything is empty, and the mind is also a kind of relationship between an embodied organism and the world. So this is why I would say my foremost commitment isn't to even to talking about consciousness or thinking about it being linked with life and in this way, but it's to what I've called non-dual naturalism, a worldview where it's non-dual. This acceptance of oneness is seen as primary, but it's naturalistic in that we can study the world through science and philosophy, and we should expect our maps to cohere and to come to some kind of synthesis. And so from that, I come to the conclusion, well, the only way that makes sense to me is if reality is relational, if consciousness is a kind of relationship between a bodily organism and an environment, and that means that life is the thing that makes consciousness, brings it into existence. So my interest in consciousness and my interest in life is really secondary to that non-duality picture of reality.
Very interesting. So you would posit that more of sort of this concept of emptiness is more around the symbolic nature of how we sort of assign meaning to reality as opposed to its physical existence. So you'd kind of fall in the middle of the extreme.
Yeah. So there's a great, I think it was the Zen Buddhist Dogen who said, reality is not what it seems, neither is it different, or neither is it otherwise, which sounds very enigmatic, but it's like the weed thing, or the bus thing. It's like, it's actually not what it looks like. It's not objectively a weed. And so then you might go to the other extreme and go, oh, it's like it's totally not there at all. It's like a hallucination in a mind of God. It's not even there when it's not perceived. It's like, no, not that either. Like, there is a thing there. There is a green thing there. It's just not a weed. So that's the things, like when you have that insight, things are not as they seem, because you were, as you say, the symbolic object recognition process. You were imputing something that's not there. You're like, whoa, that essence of weed isn't there. And then, has anything changed? Well, if it was a picture, the pixels haven't changed. It's still just a green appearance. So that really elegantly captures the paradox. I mean, it's not actually a paradox, but it's like, things are not as they seem, neither are they otherwise, I think. But again, like, this is, if one is seeing through the rigid object perception paradigm, which is just the normal state of the mind, and one hasn't done very serious contemplative kind of deconstructive practices, what I'm saying might sound, just, it may not resonate, and that's totally fine. But it can start to seem super obvious. Like, again, like looking at that picture of the weed and being able to toggle between what it feels like to impute an essence that isn't there versus seeing that it's not there, whilst nothing actually changes in the appearance. So yeah, it is some kind of, like I said, buses don't exist as buses, but you still don't want to walk out in front of one.
Right, sure. And the last question on this, and I will drop it. It's just an
No,
area
no, I
of a
love
lot
it.
of
Go as much
fascination
as
for
you want.
me. Yeah. So then finally, what do you make of wave function collapse then? Do you take maybe a Bayesian view that we're updating our knowledge? Is it something to where like a Copenhagen, like we are collapsing it? What do you make of that in connection to your idea of kind of this sort of our assigning of meaning to the world? I understand that from a kind of a non-dualist perspective. That makes perfect sense to me, and I really love that, and I'm extremely bought in on that. And just that next extra step
Yeah,
of
yeah.
that wave function collapse. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I take Carlo Rovelli's kind of relational quantum mechanics to be a really good articulation of this kind of emptiness thing. I mean, he even in his book he talks about Nagarjuna, who's the kind of one of the main Buddhist philosophers who writes about emptiness. Um, and yeah, so he in that view, it's not really any different to an informational theory of physics or a kind of where really all that's happening are interactions, communications, transmissions, but there aren't actually separate things. There's just the relationship. So reality is this kind of shimmering, interconnected, thing. And then, so before the collapse, there's potential, which I think is kind of metaphysically foundational. Um, we can go into why I think that actually makes sense as well. And then, really, the kind of the manifestation of an actual occurrence is kind of constrained by everything else in existence, like a kind of house of cards. Well, this piece has to go there because all the other pieces are where they are. Um, but it also obviously has that kind of probabilistic structure where it's like things are kind of just tumbling out of this empty potentiality at the foundation of existence and arranging themselves kind of willy-nilly as they need to with this kind of stochastic, non-deterministic, generative, creative way of being, which makes sense again. If reality is based on some outpouring of potential, basically, I think the actuality piece is because in a space of absolute infinity, anything that can happen will happen, and I think that's kind of what reality is that happening. Is that you can imagine nothing happening for some vast expanse, and at some point, if there's any possibility of any imbalance or any flux, first you get up is not down. This is like the kind of zero net energy universe hypothesis where like the energy of the universe actually cancels out. And so it's like from nothing you get, oh, actually there's a flux here now. It's empty. There is no substance there. Everything is a relationship. Up is defined against not down. And that spins out into this crazy complexity we see. But it's just that dance of the potentiality kind of, becoming, whatever it can just out of, just like inhabiting infinity. That's what I think reality is we're in infinity. And I think it kind of needs to be this way of necessity because if you start with nothing, nothing can't have limits or constraints. So the nature of nothing is that it is totally unbound, totally infinite, non-finite. And again, anything that can happen within an infinite space will happen. So it's generative as well. So I think if you start from a naturalistic logic, your first posit should be that the metaphysical ground of reality is an infinite, unbound, empty, insubstantial, potent void. And then physics and the world is the flip side of that, is that happening, but it is empty. Like it's the imputing of solidity and of like that bus has essence of bus, that atom has essence of atom. That's why when we get down to the quantum level, we're like, wait a minute, there's the way before it collapses, there isn't a thing there. Even after it collapses, I don't think there's a thing there. I think there's an interaction, an event, which is why. So I think there's also some wisdom to those Bayesian kind of epistemic models of quantum mechanics, where it's like sometimes if it's an interaction between a whole organism and its beliefs about the world, I think in some of those experiments the interaction takes the form of I mentioned it before, how you can think of interactions as being kind of what physics is, and then interactions being what the mind is. So I think in some cases, the epistemic interpretation is correct as well, where the scientist has a belief about the world, it interacts, then it's being updated. But fundamentally, yeah, it's this kind of relational picture. But I think both of those are useful theories to kind of to come to this monistic picture where the mind is not something different to physics.
Hmm. Very interesting. And I think that draws kind of a distinction because in your book, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's sort of a bifurcation between awareness and that formlessness, right? Because more of the awareness is kind of biocentric to life. And I think idealism would kind of say, hey, that formlessness is kind of the cosmic mind that's manifesting everything.
Right.
What would you expound on that?
Yeah, these are great questions. They're very subtle and to the point of like these issues. So, but it means that language kind of fails. But so, yeah, I
Right.
would be. So you're right. To communicate, I make a point of distinguishing awareness and formlessness. But yeah, the word bifurcation, I again with my non-dualistic picture, I wouldn't rush to accept that term as because
Sure.
there's a deep continuity where the formlessness of awareness is the formlessness of the ground of being. So that's why in a kind of mystical experience or a non-dual state, or if you take a huge dose of 5-MeO DMT and everything just whites out, people are correct that they notice that their formless awareness of their mind is at the center of the universe because the universe is centerless. So in the same way that every point on the surface of a sphere is the center, you are currently at the center of the universe, but it's not a center in terms of, well, I'm the center and you're not. Everywhere is the center. So that's why, in spiritual circles, sometimes people will talk about source, that like they can feel the deep continuity with what they are is not even a manifestation of source. They are source. They are that potent void. Everything is. So to tell the scientific story, I do think it makes sense to say, okay, well, you've got this metaphysical formlessness, which our minds have access to or are made of, as everything's made of it. But the cognizance, the knowingness, feels like a kind of relationship where, the way that as an embodied organism I relate to the world, like I'm having awareness of things like you and the laptop, and that knowingness seems to be somewhat kind of relational. And whereas the generative void, like potentiality of existence, like I feel like that doesn't have anything to know. Doesn't have anything to take as an object or to relate to. So I feel like it makes sense to say that I wouldn't attribute that cognizance to it. But this is where things get very subtle, is that the narrative I tell of like, okay, well, there you've got this mindless universe before life, and then you've got minds. Time is a kind of cognitive structure we use to overlay on this totally continuous, totally eternal, timeless flux of existence. So what does it really mean to say that the potent void is different to my eyes opening now? Like it's one thing. And so what I say is really I don't think it's the case that every inch of the universe is aware, but I think it's more like we are the eyes with which the universe sees. So the kind of the whole evolutionary history of the universe is taking in this space now through this cresting wave of this organism, but this organism isn't separate. So like if my eye thought it did the seeing and it didn't know anything about the brain and the photons and the whole picture, it would be delusional. It would be mistaken to think it was a separate thing that could own that seeing. In the same way, this body can't own this seeing. The seeing is the universe relating to itself.
Very subtle, but yeah, no, that's fascinating. So there's kind of so you would say that more of the kind of direct. So trying to package this question. So you'd say this formlessness, that you would not attribute a knowingness to that. That is just sort of pure potentiality. And through us as sort of the eyes of the universe, that's where this kind of relational sort of awareness, that pure state of awareness can come into play. That's sort of your position. Is that correct?
Yeah. So imagine the Big Bang. I don't think the Big Bang felt like anything. Now we could have a good conversation probably about where I might be wrong on that, or like why we might think that it could have felt like something, because the physics of mindedness that I'm talking about in life does have a deep continuity with all self-organization. So even an atom, anything that self-organizes shows the similar kind of principles, but there are certain traits, like in us, it really feels like meaning is anchored to the fact that we're going to die. And I think that's what takes things from just being structural relationships to semantic relationships, where it's like that food tastes good to me because that tasting good is synonymous with it being nourishing and holding off death. So I think meaning and significance and all that qualitative stuff of the mind, I think that spins out after death comes into play. And that's the thing that defines life, is that it kind of persists. It basically acts as if it doesn't want to die. whereas an atom doesn't do that. So that's basically why I think the atoms of the Big Bang were not having experiences. I think they were relating. I think they had a kind of, you could even call it proto-mentality in the sense that it shows the same physical principles as minds do, but I would hesitate to because it wouldn't be experiential. But sometimes, when panpsychists talk about proto-consciousness, it's hard to know if you're like, well, is it conscious? Is it not? So that picture makes sense to me. The picture where it's attributed to atoms or to the potentiality itself, I just don't see any reason why it would be. And it doesn't, in my picture, it tells you why the brain shows correlations with the mind, because it's embedded in this survival loop of the organism relating with its environment. Whereas we don't know of correlations between non-living processes and mental states. Obviously, we can't access them, so that's a big blind spot. But with the data we have, it gives a nice explanation.
Okay. And that's a wonderful segue as well to just getting right into your general perspective of consciousness being that all life is conscious, and kind of getting rid of that gradient that I likewise concur that, how are you going to say a monkey to a rat to it just all the way down, and your perspective being that being conscious is to believe that there is something externally to, whether it's food or predator or an environment, and to be in that feedback loop with the environment. If you don't mind expanding on that, just kind of setting the stage for what you believe consciousness truly is.
Yeah. So this way of thinking is kind of inspired by Immanuel Kant, who, he proposed this kind of Copernican revolution of the mind, where people thought reality is as it appears, and this kind of ties into the stuff we were talking about earlier. He proposed that actually, we're not seeing the world in itself. We're seeing our experience of the world, what he called the phenomenal world. We're seeing some model, some simulation of the world. We never actually contact the world in itself. So when I say belief, I don't mean some complex linguistic belief like I believe Paris is the capital of France. Mm-hmm. It's a bare holding that the world is a certain way. So it's a kind of knowledge state of like, if you hold up an apple in front of me and, I don't think anything, you don't say anything, I don't say anything, there's still this attributing the existence of the apple. I'm holding this mental attitude that I believe that there is a thing there called an apple in front of me, or even just the color red. I think even just any bare experience, I think a belief is a useful word to use to talk about holding the world to be a certain way. So yeah, important not to get hung up on thinking, well, could a worm have a belief? Because, obviously it doesn't have the kind of cognition we have. But if it could have the belief in, again, this raw embodied way, as it's, if there's, let's say there's sugar on one side and it wants to move towards it, it could hold the attitude, it could hold it to be the case that there's nourishment to be found on that side. And so in the way it's the relationship, it kind of enacts this relationship with the environment of believing that there's something good over there. So that's the kind of thing that I think if you put that into play and say that all living things, have to be doing this, have to be simulating the world around them. I think that, we're seeing now basically that is a necessary principle of self-organization. The thing you could pick issues with is whether or not that's experiential. And I think if you try and say, well, in simple organisms, the mechanisms are there, but the experience is something different to the mechanisms, that's when I think you get into some Descartes style dualism where you're like, oh, he used to like torture his wife's cat and be like, look, it's not actually in pain. Its lungs are moving and its vocal cords are vibrating. It's like a machine that's just making sounds. It's actually not experiencing pain. If you make that dualistic split, then I think you kind of have a really hard time to put them back together, because they are two sides of the same coin. And when you look at the physics of life, you see that this stuff emerges with the first life forms. Now, I did say there are kind of similar dynamics. Even a drop of oil shows similar dynamics where you can model it as if it has beliefs about the kind of dynamics of the water around it. But I think the crucial difference there is that it's not really a whole in the way that we're a whole. We hold ourselves together to stay alive. We kind of assert ourselves as this kind of strange loop of like, I think this is where the idea of self comes in, that we're obsessed with this, like, what's me and what's not me, because I need to keep this thing together, this body together for the time that I'm alive. And that adds an extra layer of that brings semantics, meaning, significance into existence in a way where there's no reason to think that the currents of water mean anything to the drop of oil, even if you can use the same mathematics to model complex beliefs in a human and a drop of oil.
So when it comes to the idea of, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought. There's
All right.
so many things running. There's so
Yeah.
many things flying
It
through
almost
my
happened
head
to
right
me in
now.
the last question as well. Yeah.
So I think another logical extension of that everyone's going to have to ask then is, where does the brain come into this? Obviously, you've
Right.
spent a lot of time studying the brain. What if consciousness is more of a fundamental property of life itself, and holding these beliefs, and having that interaction in a relational kind of experience with an environment, or you could even say thermodynamically trying to, stay in a state of order amongst an increasing environment of disorder, and that's kind of our constant pursuit of, food and all this different stuff. But beyond that, where does the brain kind of function in this bigger
Oh.
picture?
Yeah, and so just to flag for the audience, I'm hoping this might be a oh duh moment in terms of like obviously like yeah, this is because it's going to be quite simple what I say, but I think it clarifies stuff. So every organ in the body exists to serve life. Like why do we breathe? Because we need oxygen to keep the life process going. Why does the heart pump blood? Keep us alive. If you ask what does the brain exist for? The kind of overarching narrative is like, well, it's like a kind of fancy computer and it's kind of where you are and you get to pull the levers and get to control the body and like it's the CEO of the body. Like, no, it exists to serve life. It's just like any other organ. Like it evolved secondary to the life process. Life was there. Nervous systems came along to help along the life process. And so it's like a centralized processor for doing just that. And so it does a good job of bringing in information from the senses and, acting like a puppeteer of the muscles and the other responses the body can do. But that's it. Like it's a node in the network of life. So I'm really kind of, I guess I'm advocating for almost like imagine, I mean, it's the non-dual picture with object perception. You can really think the brain is a separate thing, but in just the same way that buses don't exist as buses, brains don't exist as brains. Brains are totally interwoven with the nervous system. It's actually an illusion to think there is a separate thing called a brain. So I want to kind of point to, I guess, like a radically holistic picture in terms of like, there is life. We are creatures. We are organisms. You don't usually hear people refer to kind of a human as an organism, but that is what we are. We're in the same way that an amoeba's moving around with its kind of, its membrane, it's very clearly this holistic structure. We're just like that. And so the brain is part of this loop that allows us to relate with the world. And that's why it shows correlations with consciousness. I mean, more specifically, because obviously other processes do that as well. It's the organ that holds and updates those beliefs about the world. So it's like a statistical engine that builds models of what's going on in the world. And that's why it has this correlation with the contents of consciousness. It doesn't bring consciousness to existence. Those statistical models don't generate consciousness. Consciousness is this relationship, but then those models are in there shaping the nature of that relationship. What is it precisely that I believe about the world? Do I believe there's two apples or one apple? And you'll see correlations in brain activity that are kind of, um, channeling that relationship of like, am I going to reach with both hands because I think there's two apples or just one? And you can think of this in a very simple way of just literally like wiring. Like you could see two packets of activity in different neural populations versus one. And, to try and come up with some story, if you just focus on the brain, the reason like there seemed to be a heart problem is like, if you're like, well, there's just electrical activity over here. Now there's one packet and two packets. How does that generate this magical ethereal consciousness thing? Sure, you've got an issue to jump from just this biological activity to that. Whereas with this relational picture, suddenly it's like, oh, actually, that's quite simple. There's this loop. And the nature of that loop, as I mentioned with the worm, you kind of enact this picture of the world based on your whole embodied way you're showing up in the world and the attitude you're bringing, what you believe about it. Again, like the weed is a weed because of this negative feeling towards it as well. It's that whole way of showing up in the world. Being afraid of a snake is synonymous with your bodily activity of fear, and that perception of fear is not something different to the way the body is acting. So yeah, the simple answer is that it's building those models, those beliefs, those simulations, but the engine is really the whole life process. It's just a secondary player to the life process.
Hmm. So that still has flavors of kind of, I'd say an idealist, individuated sort of consciousness. And maybe I don't want to mischaracterize your theory as well, but it's still kind of hard to locate, where that consciousness occurs. Because I know it's embodied and we're a relational process, but it's just kind of trying to contextualize like where maybe it's not possible, to pinpoint, but like where does that reside? How does that arise from a embodied relational process?
Yeah, so yeah, it doesn't arise from it; it just is it. So the the instinct. So the instinct of science and philosophy is to try and pull back from the world and get a picture of it. And the kind of wisdom of non-duality is to discover that the world isn't a determinate object that you can take a snapshot of and see exactly how it is. It's like a revelation that we are totally embedded in. And that's the recognition of, what quantum mechanics points to. The scientists thought they could they didn't, it sounds insane to say, but they didn't realize they were a physical system interacting with physical systems. They thought, well, no, I'm James. I'm not a collection of atoms. I'm James up here in my head, and I'm looking at the world, and the world's over there. I mean, like, if you think about it, like you are, the whole thing's the physical system, but it invites a very deep surrender because, again, that fear of death, once we have the ego is this kind of vigilant sense of alienation of like, no, this world is different from me and I've got to pull back and like hold it at a distance. So it can be quite confronting to realize that actually I don't have a picture in my head of the kind of geometry. Well, I guess I talk about loops and stuff. You could say like a consciousness is this loop of organism and environment. But if you try and really picture this relational web, it's like, I don't think it can really be done because, and this is why I said, I think to a lot of idealists, if they can really grok what I'm saying, I think they'll say, oh, actually your view's similar, basically the same as mine in that it's, just because I'm not labeling atoms as having experiences, the picture of reality is one of a unitive, empty, insubstantial flux of, where there's like, there is nothing apart from anything else. I think this flavor of like, I think it was Berkeley even referred to his idealism as insubstantialism, which is what I'm arguing for, that like, when we think there's a solid ground, that's because we're doing that object recognition process, that reification process with atoms, and we want to live in some solid building block, Lego brick universe. And then quantum mechanics says like, nope, sorry, it's a lot more fluid and potent and creative and more of a dance than that. Which is a wonderful invitation to surrender into, but that's when we get it back into the contemplative side of things. So yeah, there isn't a model, can't point to it and say where the consciousness exists, apart from the best I can say is that whole embodied loop, that relationship. It's like, I guess you could say it's an interface. Like this appearance right now, you could like, Chris Fields is a researcher who's done some very cool stuff. And the free energy principle, which is the kind of physics of life stuff I was talking about. He has a background in quantum kind of modeling stuff. And he uses these screen models where you take a whole 3D like kind of bubble of an organism, like its boundary, and you reduce it to just a single screen, like a plane. And so it's like an interface between the organism and the world. And so I guess you could say that if you want to visualize this, you could say experience is that it's a screen. It's a kind of wonder. I don't want to label the number of dimensions, but it's just this like single appearance, this single interface. But it's an interface. It's inherently a relational interface. So you could think of it as like a screen that serves to exchange information on either side of it. I don't know if any of that helps.
No, absolutely. And I was curious as a direct extension of that, because I spoke with James Glatfelder on here in a recent episode, who is an idealist and advocates for his version, syncretic idealism, which is kind of like a composite idealism. And one of the things is kind of the idea of this sort of reducing valve consciousness that, especially in mystical or even psychedelic experiences, you kind of, I believe you mentioned as well, the default mode network kind of shuts down a bit and you're able to access kind of more information. And that kind of gives rise to like being in this sort of unitive sort of experience or information field or whatever you want to call it. And we're able to access all that information. What are your thoughts on that take of it?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the details of his theory, but it's definitely true that the reducing valve thing, I think what Huxley was intuiting when he coined that term is the contemporary view of object perception, of kind of how this lived moment is so astoundingly rich in terms of the data that you can't put into words. Like, so I'm looking at a pine door in front of me right now, and it makes me think of, so I was my first 10-day silent meditation retreat. I think it was like day 8. I was sitting in the dining hall and you're all just facing the wall, so you can stay absorbed. And I remember looking at the wood in this cabin and being like, my God, they've chosen the most psychedelic wood. Like, they must have done this for fun for us, like, because there's nothing to stimulate us. But it's like, when you see like olive wood carved spoons and it's just like the most crazy, trippy psychedelic wood. I was like, this whole place is covered with this most insane, beautiful, complex wood I've ever seen. I was looking, I was like, what kind of wood is that? Like, it can't be olive wood. Like, I looked and I was like, oh, wait a minute. It's just like the most mundane pine that you get from IKEA or something. And I was like, my brain has just opened up to the fact that all wood is just, the level of detail of the grain is just insane. It's like the most awe-inspiring. You may as well be looking at a nebula or something. And it's always there. And what the object perception thing does is go, well, that rectangle, I can walk through that. That's a door. Slap a label on that. That's not an astounding, intricate, amazing appearance. That is an object. I know what that is. It has essence of door. It's a door. And so that's the reducing valve thing. It takes all this richness and we just get like sometimes they, like in machine, I remember in like the early machine learning, machine vision research, in people's papers, they would just have like, cameras, and then things would just have boxes over them. Would be like person, car, like this is how the kind of a lot of the machine vision stuff works. And it's like, that's how we see, like we're living in this like astounding revelation of the infinite to itself, totally embedded in it and yet we're like, nope, car, person. And we're just like, that's what object perception does. And we just like get pinned down into this, like this way of living that's drained of the aliveness of being. And I mean, that's a good way of understanding depression as well. And how, researchers think about it now with psychedelics is that that landscape of like how much you sink into your concepts gets really rigid. And you're just like, nope, I'm a person. Not only that, I'm a bad person. The world is like, and you just get this kind of fixed, way of being. And then psychedelics flatten, or meditation like flattens that landscape, and you can suddenly be a lot more flexible and look at the world in different ways. I have no idea what your original question was now. I really got into to riffing on
No,
that.
you're good. No, I'm just riding the wave with you as well.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great time to segue as well. And it's still similar because I'd love to talk a little about Michael Levin's work. I know you referenced him in your book as well. How do you believe that plays into, confirms, or it just revises your perspective on consciousness and the idea of sort of these cognitive light cones, and sort of when these individuated sort of cognitive light cones of these, let's say, cells start coming together, there's more of a cohesive awareness, and it can building more and more complex even to us eventually. So what's kind of your take on that?
Yeah. I'm a great admirer of Michael's work. I think it's rare to see someone doing such great theoretical and experimental work. And it's interesting because we do have different worldviews. He seems to have this kind of idealistic, or like idealist rather than idealistic, view. And he's got these thoughts about Platonism, which doesn't fit with my view and I've not really explored, but I'm curious because I respect his thinking to delve in more to his work there. But his cognitive light cone stuff really resonates. So yeah, that's this kind of idea, you could say, of like how far in space and time can we have concerns, and that fits with kind of my belief thing. Like the worm might believe there's sugar there's like glucose on one side, but we can believe things about what we want to be true of our retirement decades in the future, so that's a much bigger cognitive light cone. And what's incredible about that work, which I totally sign off on this work, is he models processes like cancer as, to do with these kinds of cognitive light cones. So if you have a very large cognitive light cone, say you take the Buddha or someone who's let go of self-concern and is showing up in a world, a mode of radical compassion, or Jesus, some spiritual teacher who's just like, this isn't about me, this is about humanity, and I'm going to push my cognitive light cone to the extremes. And I think there's a reason to do that because it creates harmony. When you strip down your cognitive light cone to just be about you, that's egotism, narcissism, and you're inherently closed to feedback from the world. So it does create discord. And because the world is relational and we're embedded within it, that's particularly why it will come back to bite you. So with cancer, that's what seems to happen. I think this is how Michael describes it. I think he's totally right. Is that the cognitive light cone of the cancer cell, the way it's trying to preserve itself, it gets this instead of having a fluid kind of perception of identity. I don't want to attribute mindedness. So be careful with my language, but we could say metaphorically some perception of identity of like where it ends or the way it's functioning. Instead of it being a fluid sense of identity, there's this rigid kind of, okay, this is about me and my survival. And so I'm going to, try and expand myself as much as possible and feed off of what's not me, what's other. And because it's embedded within the host organism, that's actually a very unwise course of action. It's not going to lead to harmony because it's going to destroy the thing that it depends on for its existence. And I think
sounds
that
kind of
picture,
familiar.
I was about to say, is exactly where we're at as a civilization. It's about us. It's about humans. It's not about who cares if the air, the water, the bees, who cares if all the insects die? Oh, wait a minute. The insects are pollinating the plants that we eat. Oh no, now we're dead. We're barreling into that now. People not caring about the possibility of bees populations reducing. I think it's actually one of the most important things for people to realize is this idea. And I think the cognitive light cone is a great way of phrasing it. Because it fits with the science of life. It fits with kind of contemplative wisdom about what it means, like why it's wise to show up in a non-egoic, compassionate way from a selfish point of view as well. From like, if you want to survive, it's better for you to be anchored to long-term goals, widespread goals. You see this in indigenous cultures with, I can't remember which Native American one there is, but where they have this idea of 7 generations. You think about the impact of any actions 7 generations into the future. And that's like, that doesn't make any rational sense from like an egoic, well, I'm just me. I'm separate from everyone else. I don't care what happens. I'm out for me in my lifetime. Like, what do I care 7 generations from now what happens? But clearly, if you're identified with humanity, being, life, the flourishing of sentient creatures, it makes a lot of sense to try to not have short-term extractive thinking. And you look back at like medieval castles and medieval churches in Europe, some of them took centuries to build. Like designed this thing and they're like, okay, we're going to do this. I'm not going to see even a fraction of it completed, but we have this sense of identity that is bigger than the pinned down ego. And I think that's more than anything what we need to be waking up to at this point in human history, because that fearful ego that thinks it's going to die, that thinks there's some error in existence, that thinks it's the surfer on the wave, it's an idea. It's a belief. It doesn't exist. It's not there. And so like you can look for it and you can experience, you can discover that and then go, oh, I've been running around defending this thing that isn't even there. Like if you thought you had a gold coin in your hand and everyone wants it and you're like running around trying to protect it. And then one day you're like, wait a minute, I've never actually looked. And you just open your hand and it's just not there. You're like, oh, I've been like stressed and like, why was I doing that? Like, and this is where people start talking about like a cosmic joke. It's just like, I was playing this weird prank on myself of selfhood. So that's the reason to engage in the kind of contemplative terrain, because there's a lot of, relief from suffering to be had. And then it also, I think this is why religion's a thing, because this terrain is what leads to greater outcomes in the long term. So I think it's the kind of the core of ethics, like why ethics comes out of religion a lot of the time when it's, and it can obviously go off the rails. I wasn't a fan of the Catholicism I was raised in. But I think, we're at a time in history where I think we can have a sincere reckoning with this terrain in a non-dogmatic, scientifically grounded way. I think it's what the world needs now more than ever.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And I think the cognitive light cone idea too is so cool because it's I wouldn't even call it a metaphor. I'd call it an analogy to real life. I mean, we as human beings are our best when we're connected, when we are connected to something greater and involved in truly something beyond just the illusion of what is yourself. Because I think that's when you sort of quote unquote metastasize, is when you become isolated and alone and depressed and hidden away and and so deep in your ego and within yourself is when all of the depression and the anxiety, and just my personal observation within life, it's almost a direct parallel to kind of a human being metastasizing on a more macroscopic level versus like a cancer cell, kind of an as above so below type of thing.
And also, it's not just those traits of like depression and things, but also narcissism. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
common for people who have kind of dark personality traits who show up in the world in a way that cause harm and exploit other people in the same way that I don't want to, I don't want to call narcissist cancers, because I believe at the core of it, there's a kind of a kind of a
Sure.
wounded, like we're all, when you see through the self thing, you see that we are all each other. So the worst narcissist in the world is me with different conditioning. So I'm not demonizing, but just functionally, that the desire to prioritize yourself and in the course of doing that, harming others, very, very often leads to isolation, leads to relationships don't work. You end up alone and unhappy and blaming everyone else. But like, again, like the cancer cell isn't going to end up having loads of friends with other organs in the other parts of the body, right? Because it's like showing up in this hostile way. So there is I think those people want to be, on the deepest level, want to be rescued from their separation. It's a bit like someone who's in a psychotic state, a delusional state of separation, where they're like, yeah, lashing out and attacking other people. You don't need to demonize that person. You need to create structures that can calm them down, show them support. Michael Levin makes this point, and he's actually using it in experimental studies to try to, using this kind of way of thinking to electrically reestablish networks between the cancer and the surrounding tissue, to kind of,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that, like, imagine a support circle helping someone who was being like really toxic and kind of egoic, showing them that actually you have a home here you don't have to be operating in this mode of separation. He's actually
Hmm.
doing that work and I think that's an incredibly promising way, to look for a cure for cancer. I mean, again, like, huge admirer of his stuff. When I say it out loud, it's insanely incredible synthesis of theory and experiment, with real world consequences. I think in those studies, it's been a while since I read them, but I think the point he was making is that the cancers were still expressing kind of cancer coding genes, but they just weren't manifesting as cancers, as tumors, which again fits with this kind of update from a reductionist view where it's like, well, it's, genetic mistake, but to this radically holistic view of, we need to be thinking about holes within holes, like a fractal of like cells and then organs and parts of the body within this whole, and how we relate, how things interface and relate with each other, rather than, well, this gene turned on and that gene turned off and that's what creates cancer. I think he's really on to the right picture there.
Mm-hmm. And one last thing as well on Michael Levin's work, because I think it kind of sheds some light on sort of my perspective on some of this, and with these cognitive, or I should say with these experiments, where there's sort of like a informational template, and just by modulating bioelectrically certain things within the organism, there's sort of information that's there, almost external, for how it kind of like morphologically manifests itself, and all that stuff. And curious to even trace that back through evolution, because one question I have for you is, is perhaps starting at the cell too late still? Is it still kind of a similar problem where, well, where did the laws of physics from? How did the amino acids come together, to form like these proteins? And what are these sort of forms and structures and ways that these sort of like organic molecules come together, coalesce, become greater complexity? And there's this sort of, I would even say, a teleological drive towards complexity, and it's this constant upward push. And it seems that one more thing I'll add on to that is, for me, it's just the awe of life. I mean, there's just, as you said, even that's door, that's car, and it gets so watered down. I mean, one example is, recently I was watching this video on this certain larva, and it hangs down from a leaf, and so that the ants can come take it away, and then they take it to their little den, but it releases certain pheromones that makes the ants think that it's one of them, and so they feed it and nurture it, and eventually hatches, or becomes like a butterfly, or whatever happens. That is a little bit of a botched story there, but my point is the cognitively, I'm not saying the caterpillar's over there thinking I need to make, certain pheromones, but like, there seems to be something that's far greater than mutations, in my opinion.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Yeah. So I'm a Darwinian to my core, in the sense that, not that explains everything, but I think the principle of selection is, I mentioned that I think the metaphysical foundation of existence is this outpouring, this kind of potency. But then the things that actually arise, the forms that take form, when I said about the wave function collapse being how it's kind of pinned down by everything else in existence, I think that fractal that we call the kind of, the manifest universe is that takes the structure it does because of Darwinian logic, which is to say things that are good at persisting will persist, which can sound utterly trivial, but it's an explanation of all the complexity of nature that is contained within itself. So you don't have to appeal to a designer. You don't, like the blind watchmaker thing. You don't have to say there was some other intelligence which offers infinite regress. You look at this logic of things that are good at persisting will persist. And then reality then becomes this kind of, this thing of niches, forming into each other to create this incredibly rich tapestry of existence. And so in that picture, this fits with the kind of the teleology thing in the sense where I don't think there's anyone or anything that decided it was good or that we should be driving towards complexity. I think it's happening just very logically and lawfully in the way that selection kind of compounds on itself. But I think that selection is like a current in existence that kind of pulls forms into existence. So that principle, I mean, not that it exists in anything other than the dynamics of whatever's happening, but it's like a kind of I guess this is a bit Platonic, actually. This is probably a good route for me into Michael's stuff. But it's like that principle is what creates all forms. You mentioned amino acids and then onto life. And so I think that's the engine. And that principle is also what's captured in the free energy principle, the kind of the predictive processing, the principle that gives a really solid foundation of predictive processing stuff in the brain on self-organization. And that does go beyond life, as I said, to all forms. So if you think of how it's the free energy principle was originally basically saying that when the brain is operating, if you think of its fundamental task as not being surprised, as having models of the world and using those models to predict what's going to happen, and it basically not wanting to, constantly be surprised. Because, if I cross the road with my eyes closed, I'm going to be surprised unpleasantly by cars. And if I'm constantly surprised all the time, that's the same thing as dying, basically. Because to be self-organized, organization is a subset of disorder. Disorder statistically is, this is Boltzmann's work, is like the reason disorder is because there's many more ways to be disordered than ordered. To be a sandcastle is to be a subset of the ways that the sand can be arranged, and a pile of sand is a lot more, there are a lot more ways to be disordered than ordered. So if you're being surprised, statistically it's inevitable you're going to move towards disorder. So to be orderly is to not be surprised. And this doesn't just apply to a human crossing the road, this applies to everything. But except that, when you're thinking about an atom, I don't think we need to think of surprise. At that point, we're analogizing the perceptual loop we have of action and behavior. We're taking that mathematical framework that began with brains embodied in life forms like us, and then analogizing it. But the physical principles are still there. This has been fleshed out as what's called Bayesian mechanics now, which is kind of like a physics of forms. So instead of having atoms are what are most real, and then everything else, or like subatomic particles, and then everything else is kind of epiphenomenal, you could say this is like a fractal picture of existence where at each layer, whatever self-organizes is real. I mean, it doesn't have that metaphysical thing. It's just a physics model. But anyway, the point of all this is that if you have I'm validating the thing you were saying about how there's a continuity, like why life? Why does this begin with life? I mentioned before with death, I think, is the thing that brings semantics, meaning into existence. But it's interesting to flesh out this, like what's going on before life. So if you look at an island self-organizing, you have a circular piece of sand in some, say, the Maldives, somewhere where there's like shallow shifting sands. It would be strange if there was a very shallow approach to the island and then a very steep wall, like say a steep wall of sand. The island's like a really, really tall box, basically. And that's naturally arisen. Like we would look at that and we say something strange there. That looks like someone's ordered it that way. What would make more sense is if there was a continuity where like a sine wave, say there's a really deep trough in the ocean, then you get a kind of steeper bank where the island forms. And if it's shallower, then you get a shallower island. Well, you could model that with the free energy principle and say that if you model the shifting sands as like the waves are like sensory input, if the sand shifting out is like action, you basically get this resonance where like what's going on there, the sand on the island never touches the sand in the trough in the ocean. They have no direct connection, but you get this kind of non-local emergent resonance where the shape of the island comes to correspond with the shape of the landscape totally out of reach around it. So that's the same thing that's happening with minds, where the structure of my belief landscape becomes sculpted to match my environment. And that's because it needs to for survival, basically. So selection is running through at all these scales. And again, survival is just persistence. So like the version of the island that persists is the one that uses these dynamics. So that's kind of why it takes that form. Yeah.
So to even just get even more kind of microscopic onto that kind of point. So even one step back, my kind of biggest question I typically have that is maybe unanswerable is, what allows in this context of what you're explaining, because that makes perfect sense, sort of a Darwinian algorithm, even universal Darwinism, it makes perfect sense, most adapted to their environment, gonna, so on and so forth. But when it comes to sort of that caterpillar in that same instance, just zooming in on that one, what awareness of their environment would be necessary to understand what pheromones need to be released for those ants and to know to do those maneuvers? For me personally, it seems more than sort of just a variation of a gene. It's like, how would something, an organism at that small of a scale, have an awareness of what pheromone, it would need to produce and to go through that? What would you make of that?
Yeah. So there is a spectrum here from complex cognitive behaviors through to reflexive behaviors. And reflexive behaviors do seem to exist, right? In terms of like you burn your hand, there's a simple loop where you just retract it, and typically before you've even consciously felt anything. And I think what's happening with reflexive behaviors is, so with the cognitive behaviors, there's something called counterfactual depth, which is or counterfactual richness, which is an ability to model the world as being a way other than it is. So if I'm thinking about what drink do I want to drink, I can simulate whether do I want tea or water or coffee. And whereas if I'm pulling my hand back from the flame, that's been so sculpted through evolution, there is no counterfactual depth there. The system knows there's one answer here. And so you could say counterfactual depth is a more technical way of describing imagining. And so I think that's another way of thinking about why certain behaviors aren't associated with an internal experience and others are. And so with the caterpillar example, it would depend on the behavior. It's possible that there could be a very simple, evolution can hack reflexes. So say there's a pheromone that just already triggers an existing brain network. It could totally actually just be that. But, or there could be more complex cognitive things going on. I'd need to see the details of it. But it's interesting to note that this picture doesn't mean that everything is suddenly, it doesn't mean everything has a super rich cognitive world, although I think we'd be surprised. But it really just means that there's some experience, it's like the worm having some positively valenced feeling tone towards having nourishment versus it just being a robot. That's the key takeaway. And then it's kind of a case by case basis. And it gets really hard to think about cognitive richness of creatures that are very unlike us. Even just thinking about what echolocation would be like, I'm sure that's like something. I'm sure it's a rich experience of the world. But yeah, it gets quite hard. That's where I found it hardest to kind of to come down and on some rigid solution. And I don't think it's really necessary. It makes for good conversation, but just because it's based in speculation really rather than hard science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely don't think that those organisms at that small at a level are capable of that level of cognition. I think there's definitely a heavy selection process happening. And I think the last question I'd want to ask on this is kind of from the more informational standpoint. Is it possible that these sort of these maybe Michael Levin would say are like templates or like kind of Platonic forms, or is there potentially as an informational basis guiding this evolution and these very strong, intelligent, appearing at least, leaps that organisms like this have? What's your perspective on that side of physics?
Yeah, I haven't found any need to appeal to a kind of a space of Platonic forms. But again, I respect Michael's stuff so much. I'm curious as to why he does. And I read his most recent paper on that. Maybe he's had one more recently, but a few months ago. But I should return to it. Yeah, I mean, so to me, it feels like there's this creative outpouring where things are really kind of, evolution is just like MacGyvering solutions on the fly and scaffolding them on top of each other. And it's that engine of selection is what intelligence is. It's the kind of, it pulls into existence problem solving dynamics, because problem solving dynamics are good for survival. So it's, I think maybe there's one Platonic form, and it's the selection, the logic of selection. I don't know if you want to call that a Platonic form, but yeah, so it's a lot more of a kind of, there's no guiding hand. The reality is totally out of control. It's a runaway train. It's just kind of, and that's part of its unbounded nature, is it just has we have no idea where this thing's going. We don't know if we're going to have interplanetary or, extinct on the Earth, or what's going to be evolve in the future. It's totally, and I do think it will just keep going and going. Yeah, I see no reason that the observable universe and its end would be the end of all of existence. And again, I think total nothingness forever is an unsustainable prospect because of the logic of it being infinite, and therefore something's going to happen at some point. So I think, yeah, it's just totally unbounded, totally unconstrained, rather than being guided.
So on a bit more of, I guess, a philosophical note or even metaphysical note, if the universe isn't inherently meaningful and we are the ones assigning meaning to it on the fly as kind of part of our existence, and it's more of a formless, primordial potentiality, if you will, what do you make of quote unquote spirituality then? Or what would you make of an after, the illusion of death, right? Because I know as you're saying in your non-dual perspective, but in that context, what do you picture as death? What do you picture as spirituality, if the spirit may be something that even we're conceptualizing potentially?
Yeah. So yeah, this morning I was reading a paper about positive psychology, and it had it said meaning is one of the key things that's important. And then it unpacked meaning as like spirituality and stuff like that, which I found interesting, because to me, the deepest insight of spirituality is meaninglessness in a liberating way, is in that reality is a play. It's a meaningless play. And like, if you stop and ask a kid what's the meaning of their play, you're going to ruin the play. Like, it's just not supposed to have an articulatable, a meaning that can be articulated. And we see this with positive psychology research in flow states, where to be utterly absorbed in something to the point where you're not questioning your existence that is the meaning of life. The moment you stop to ask what the meaning of life is in a way that can be put into words, you've blown it. Like, that's, now you're not in touch with the meaning of life. So it's that non-conceptual beingness it totally justifies your existence. So to me, that's the core of spirituality, is to get out of concepts, to get out of the mind and into being. And to learn to be okay with the fact that meaning making is part of that frantic survival, fearful separation mode, and that meaninglessness isn't what it seems to be. Because from that perspective, it seemed bad. You're like, I need meaning because meaning gives me a way to navigate and to have control and all this other stuff that I think I need. It turns out we don't need. And if we can surrender that mental functioning and learn to be more okay in the present moment, without that cognitive control, as I say, that then the question doesn't arise. It's like Alan Watts, the American Buddhist. He taught lots of different religions, but there's a quote from him. There's something like, the meaning of life is simply to be alive. It's so obvious that everyone's always running around like looking for it, but it's that obvious, something to that effect. And that's it. It's to just be alive without questioning it, really. And one thing I'll say as well, since you mentioned spirit was a word that I never, I always had this sense of like, why is it called spirituality? Like, like a lot of people, it was a kind of turn off. And then as I got to the end of my book, I was like, wait a minute, what I've described here is a picture where So spirit means breath in like most languages. It comes up in a lot of different languages where the word breath is used. It's like I've come up with a picture of articulating a picture of reality where it's a totally insubstantial fluid flux, and the essence of what we are is connected with the essence of existence. Like we are the same. Yeah, like our breath is the breath of the universe. I was like, oh, like this. I've described a picture where all that exists is spirit, but spirit has a very precise definition, and it's exactly the same thing as informational digital physics interpretations of quantum mechanics. The relational quantum mechanics thing. But I'm like, oh, like I can see why like that reality is more like a kind of a breath-like thing that we are totally. Yeah, as I say, like our breath is the breath of the universe rather than some solid, fixed, determinate object. So I still don't use that word because I think because I'm keen to convey that it's not a supernatural picture of reality. But it totally makes sense to me now why spirituality is the word people would use for this.
Beautifully put. I guess an extension of that would be, what would you make of purpose? Because even my studies of flow state and even experiencing flow state it's heavily revolving around things you're passionate about.
Right.
Is where you're able to really dive into that. Well, then what is passion, and why is that kind of hard ingrained? And obviously life is fluid, and your purpose can change, and your interest can shift. But there's kind of a core essence you're kind of pre-packaged with here. If there's no meaning, then what would you label that?
Yeah, so I guess I would say there is no ultimate meaning or no absolute meaning or no kind of objectively existing meaning. There are no rules written in the universe. There's no rule book. Like when I was a kid, I was told there was a rule book. God had the rule book, and it was, don't steal, don't kill, don't, have blind faith. And if you get any of these wrong, that's metaphysically, consequential. And it was liberating to see very convincingly that there is no objective rule book of reality. So that doesn't mean we can't have meaning, can't make meaning, can't have purpose. And my orientation, as I mentioned, is one of a middle way between extremes. And so I don't advocate collapsing into, okay, well, now I'm going to negate all of my common sense lived experience as a human and say, there is no self, there's just the one, I am the oneness of existence, and that's it. No, like, I mean, it was really after fleshing out how to communicate and guide people through that radical deconstructive path that I had to kind of turn back and go, all right, well, now I can guide people well in this terrain if people want to go onto the really deep, radical, transformative liberation, contemplative stuff. But like, not everyone wants to do that. Like I'm a bit of I'm not a very normal person for my kind of obsession with going really deep in that terrain, and that's fine. And so I was like, well, what does the average person want? They want to, flow. This is where I more recently became interested in things like flow, positive psychology, because like it's totally adjacent to this stuff. There's experience of loss of self, loss of changes in time. It allows you to talk about this stuff, but in a way that's not as confronting, not as deconstructive. So you can have your purpose. You can just be at work. You could even just be trying to like do a boring, like send out an email that's totally, you don't want to do it because it's super boring. And then you learn, actually, if I set a time limit, that allows me to get into flow more because it gives me some challenge. And so like, that's not confronting. That's like totally ordinary, mundane, daily stuff, but it helps relieve a bit of suffering. It helps people show up in the world in a way that feels better. And that's what drives me, is like, the reason I talk about the super radical deconstructive stuff is it's the root issue. If you can see there is no surfer on the wave, boom, like you've pulled up the issue by its root. But again, that's a radical journey. Most people don't want to do that. So now I'm trying to come to a kind of to flesh out the other side of the picture. Having good purpose. For me, I guess you could say like there is no ultimate rule book, but once you surrender into that fully and you accept that, and then you come back into your humanness, and then you start to tell stories and have concepts again, then the first concept that feels very, very reasonable is that suffering is bad. And that's really built into us as living things. And you see this in Buddhism, which is why compassion arises from surrendering deeply into the absolute. So that gives me a really grounded purpose. That is my purpose. And and so from there, I can see it both ways. If someone said like, okay, but does the universe think that it matters about relieving human suffering? Like, did the Big Bang care about that? Does like the potent void care about that? I'd be like, well, only so far in that I'm a manifestation of that potent void. And, so it's like, there is a harmony there where it's like, no, but also yes. So you get to kind of have your cake and eat it too, basically.
Fascinating. I guess the last question I'd ask on that is around concepts of karma and reincarnation, because I think if there's a universe that isn't trying to necessarily foster our spiritual growth, and it's more of at its primordial base, meaningless, and sort of we're constructing that, and we're creating purpose and meaning in our experiences. The ideas of karma or reincarnation would imply that there is almost like a benevolent sort of overseer who's trying to foster our growth. What would you be your perspective on those sort of Eastern philosophies?
Yeah, I think so. Most religions have the kind of esoteric and exoteric teachings, where there's the kind of teachings for the majority of people, and then the kind of the special teachings for the monks, the priests, the ones in the know, the mystics. And I think a lot of I resisted this distinction for a very long time because it feels patronizing to me, and I wanted to believe we could all be mystic monks and stuff. And I've come to reluctantly accept there's a reason that like most people are not oriented in that way, which is again my modern version of that is now trying to think about positive psychology and flow states and stuff. But I do suspect there are kind of like simplistic pictures of heaven. There's like nice comforting stories we can tell, and you can, I know lots of people who like having simplistic vision, an idea that there's a heaven where they'll go to and they'll meet people who they knew when they died, and like family members who, like, I'm not going to argue with them about that. Like, this seems to be a useful thing for them. So some of it, I think, could be in that category. I think karma, as in like causality, I think is deeply relevant in terms of not as in like there's some, you're going to get everything's. I mean, I was going to say not in the sense that your comeuppance is going to come for everything you do, but I did mention in the cancer analogy the way that things come back if you have this kind of separation to bite you. So I think there's truth there, but also just the uneven distribution. Like, some people just have a lot more karma to deal with than other people in terms of stuff they're dealing with. And that turns out to not just, you might think that's bad, but it turns out to not be just bad. Because like in that view, I had a lot of negative karma, and that drove me to really reckon with this stuff, which led to a profound release from suffering. And so like, I'm actually really happy for that. Really glad I had this incredible amount of suffering that needed to be unburdened. It wasn't an option for me to not go deeply into this stuff. I needed to. So I think that those teachings are useful there. Yeah, and then reincarnation's a funny one, because I think the core wisdom it points to me is that the thing I said before about when you see through the self, you see that we are all each other already. So it's like not only reincarnation, like I will be reborn as someone else. I'm currently existing as you. You're existing as me. There is no. This has been called kind of open individualism in philosophy, where there is only the universe looking at itself through multiple viewpoints. So it kind of points in that direction to me, but I don't take a kind of a literal view that there's a soul or something that will be reincarnated.
Well, as we wrap up here, I would love just to, number one, just get your final thoughts on kind of what you would, I guess, at the core of all of these messages, I think you would like to, get to an audience maybe on their own spiritual path, or, looking to release certain suffering from their life, and kind of a path or a starting point that you would maybe recommend there, given everything we've spoken about today, and as well where we can find you, a bit more about maybe your links, books, all that good stuff as well.
Yeah, thank you. So after I'd written the book, just before it came out, I absorbed myself in producing materials, guided meditations, practices for precisely this kind of question, because I didn't want to say, I don't know, like use someone's meditation app, because I've got I've got my critiques of everything that's out there. So I made my own thing of what I think covers the bases. Also because I just, also what drives me is, this stuff doesn't, it does get weird in a sense, because you're questioning reality, but it doesn't have to be weird in the way, in the 70s with like weird gurus and stuff like that. Like, we're at a point where this can be based in science and best practices psychologically, like in terms of psychological safety and stuff like that. So if you want those kinds of things, you can go to innerspaceinstitute.org, and I've got some free practices there. There's also a membership community you can join if you want to help support the mission, of like producing more of this stuff. And yeah, I've got a YouTube channel, Dr. James Cooke, with an E on the end. And there you'll find video versions of my podcast, Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke, which also has audio versions and the usual podcasting apps. My website, drjamescooke.com, has links to most of my stuff. including the articles, and Dawn of Mind is the book. Yeah, I think I'm really bad with this promotional stuff. I need some checklist in my head to make sure I've gone through everything. But that's the main stuff. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questions, and it's been really fun to chat.
Absolutely, James. And thank you so much for your time as well. And it's been enlightening and inspiring. So I really appreciate your time and wisdom today. And I'll make sure everything is linked up in the description. But thank you so much again, James. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Jared.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Quantum Theory Podcast. If you desire to embark on the path of self-mastery, visit quantumtheorypodcast.com to join a like-minded community of purpose seekers committed to personal growth.